Welcome to those both here with us in person and those joining us online to the 2025 Alice Amsden Memorial Lecture, with no better person to deliver it than Ha-Joon Chang. This lecture has been running since 2013 in honor of Alice Amsden, who was a professor at MIT and one of the seminal contributors, in particular to the topic of industrialization in Asia, as well as more broadly around economic development. She was a lecturer in APORDE and always made time to travel here, even as she became unwell. And this lecture was instituted after her passing in 2012. We've had a number of eminent lecturers over the years delivering this lecture. Adeyemi Depiolo is in the room, one of the previous lecturers, Thandika Mkandawere, Carlos Lopez, Jose Antonio Ocampo, Jawati Ghosh, Okabai, and many others. It's really a lineup of some of the leading thinkers on development in Africa, as well as more broadly. And it's really an honor and a privilege for us to have this year's lecture delivered by Ha-Joon Chang. I have a biography of Ha-Joon here, which speaks to all of his accomplishments. I think he's well known to most of us here. There's so much which I could say about him. He's a distinguished research professor at SOAS, where he also co-leads the Center for Sustainable Structural Transformation and the Development Leadership Dialogue. He's authored or edited 28 books, which have been published in translated into 46 languages. They've sold millions of copies. He's received various awards and accolades for his achievements. But I would maybe just like to step away from his bio and highlight two things which I think are particularly relevant. The first being the unmatched impact, I would say, on the theory and discourse around industrial policy. For us now, industrial policy has become increasingly widely accepted, both academically and in policy. It's no longer a dirty word, although, of course, different institutions and policymakers and so on think differently about what it means, but industrial policy is now widely accepted, and this wasn't always the case. When Ha-Joon, I think, began writing and working on this, as far as I know, during his doctoral studies in Cambridge in the late 1980s, it was really going against the grain. There weren't a lot of people even working on industrial policy, let alone highlighting its importance. And I would really say that Ha-Joon's impact has been unparalleled. There are many people working on it who've made really important contributions. Ha-Joon, in his various books on this, starting with the seminal book, The Political Economy of Industrial Policy, and as well those which had a more popular orientation, have made industrial policy cool. They've broadened the knowledge of industrial policy and the appreciation of its importance among scholars and of policymakers, and have really contributed to generations of researchers and practitioners who are working in this field, and I count myself amongst those. The second particular I'd say impact of Ha-Joon that I wanted to highlight is that probably we might not be sitting here today, gathered here at APORDE, if it wasn't for Ha-Joon. So people might be aware, or maybe not, that Ha-Joon initiated APORDE, which is the parent of APORDE, the Cambridge Advanced Program on Rethinking Development Economics, which he ran for a number of years in Cambridge. I was myself one of the early participants in that program, and came back to assist him with it in a subsequent year. For me personally, and for many other people, it was a really formative experience. I'm still in touch with personally and professionally with people I met there, and still remember some of the lectures. And from APORDE, they grew to be LAPORDE, which ran for a couple of years in Latin America. And I think the most successful offshoot, APORDE, which has now been running for 20 years. So, of course, there might have been other courses and so on without that, but I'm not sure whether we would all be sitting here today if it wasn't for Ha-Joon. So I think it's really fitting that we have Ha-Joon here to deliver this year's Alice Amsden Memorial Lecture. Let me also, there are too many people to acknowledge individually here, but let me just acknowledge one person, which is Ha-Joon's wife, Ha-Joon. We're privileged to have you with us tonight. So Ha-Joon, over to you. We look forward to your lecture.
Thank you, Fiona, for that incredibly generous introduction. Yeah, it's my great honor to give this Alice Amsden Memorial Lecture. I didn't know Alice personally that well, but her work was very important for me. You know, as Fiona said, I started my PhD research nearly 40 years ago, back in 1987, at the height of what may be called neoliberal counter-revolution. And yes, suicidally for the time, my research topic was industrial policy. At the time, the topic was such a taboo that if I told people that, oh, I'm working on industrial policy for my PhD, they would like look at me again, and as if I said, I don't know, I'm a Satanist, or my PhD is on proving that Elvis Presley is still alive, you know. Yeah, today, I mean, it's, you know, all the rage and, you know, the totally acceptable, although, I mean, the mainstream economists still have a serious problem in downplaying its role and, you know, the recommending only the mildest ineffectual form of it. That's another story. In those days, the debate on industrial policy really centered on the so-called East Asian miracle economies, but especially South Korea, which is where I'm from, and Taiwan. I mean, of course, Japan was there, but even mainstream neoclassical economists who didn't like industrial policy found it impossible to deny the existence of industrial policy in that country. Because after all, what started off the debate on industrial policy at the time was the success of Japan. Even so, these people did their best to downplay the scale of industrial policy in Japan, to deny that it had many positive effects. I still remember one influential article at the time trying to argue that actually industrial policy is not behind Japan's success because it was not very strong. Yeah? So the so-called evidence to back that argument was to show that industrial subsidies paid by the government of Japan as a proportion of GDP was below average among OECD countries. Yeah? So actually, Japan doesn't have much industrial policy. But these people didn't mention that the Japanese government has such tight regulation on banking that the banks were basically lending money to firms that the government dictated. The government sanctioned and organized the nearly 300 cartels for collective investment, recession management, export. You know, I mean, these are people who probably have never been to Japan, doesn't even speak Japanese, and then they were telling the world that, well, actually, they don't have much industrial policy. But still, in the Japanese case, they couldn't completely deny it. Because after all, Japan's industrial policy was what prompted the debate at the time. But when it came to Korea and Taiwan, which were much less known than Japan at the time, mainstream economists basically argued that their success owed to free trade and free market policy. And they used the examples of these countries as weapons to destroy industrial policy in developing countries at the time. Look, get rid of your so-called import substitution, the industrialization strategy. South Korea, Taiwan, these are proofs that free trade, free market policies, export-oriented development is the way forward. Of course, anyone who had even passing familiarity with these countries knew that they were two of the most controlled economies in the world at the time. Yeah, I still remember that this article in, I think it was in the Economist or the Financial Times, which said that South Korea, it was a special article on South Korea. South Korea has the most controlled economy in the world outside the socialist bloc. No, because at the time, the government owned basically all the banks, and there were complete control over import and export, and huge amount of subsidies. And even while the increasing number of the academic studies and journalist reports in English and other foreign languages were coming out at the time, the neoliberal mainstream economists refused to accept the existence of the industrial policy in these countries, because they were so important in the neoliberal mythology. Because they were like, for them, the ultimate examples that proved their theory is right. So they just couldn't admit it. But what made it impossible for them to ignore an honest description of Korea and Taiwan was this famous book by Alice. So this book, Asia's Next Giant, which was published in 1989, blew big holes in the orthodox misrepresentation of the East Asian miracle by not only documenting in detail the huge extent of industrial policy in Korea, and she had actually done a lot of work on Taiwan before she worked on Korea. So of course, this is a book about Korea, so she doesn't talk about Taiwan that much, but she also had a lot of evidence for Taiwan. But this book also provided a historically informed and theoretically sophisticated explanation of how the policy succeeded. So she wasn't just talking about the simple effect of protectionism. She was talking about learning at the firm level. She was talking about the historical political economy. It really was a comprehensive book. And yeah, after this book, it became impossible to deny that industrial policy at least existed, in Korea and Taiwan. I mean, people still did their best, including the famous 1993 World Bank East Asian Miracle Study, tried to deny the effectiveness of these policies, came up with all kinds of dubious statistical analysis, proving that these policies didn't make any difference. Interestingly, Alice's book, while undermining this neoliberal orthodoxy, also undermined the then influential counter-orthodoxy of dependency theory. Because dependency theory, which was quite influential in the 60s and 70s and early 80s among, say, the more left-leaning people in developing countries, yeah, they were not all saying the same thing, but most dependency theorists argue that anything more than basic industrialization, like, I don't know, flour milling or the sugar refining, these things cannot happen in the periphery. The global economic hierarchy is such that, and the actions of the center countries, the imperialist countries, are such that anything more than basic industrialization is not going to happen in the periphery. And then lo and behold, there were Korea and Taiwan. And then the dependency theories try to explain away this the anomaly by saying that, well, these countries succeeded only because they were getting special treatment by the United States. As you know, I mean, during the Cold War, these were very often called the garrison states of the American empire. So that dependency theories argue, oh, they got a lot of extra foreign aid, they have special market access and so on. And Alice in the book showed that, yeah, those things either didn't exist. I mean, as far as I'm concerned, as she said, no evidence that Korea had any special, Korea and Taiwan had any special access to the US market. In those days, these countries are buying up multi-fiber agreement textile quotas from other developing countries because they couldn't sell enough. And the US was not going to let them sell the indefinite amount. She said foreign aid was for a while important, but from the 60s, it was not that important. And then more importantly, she showed that the state in Korea and Taiwan had huge amount of agency. So dependency theory is a very structuralist theory. The world is structured in this way, and that basically defines what happens. And Alice's work on Korea and Taiwan showed the extent of agency by developing countries, especially by their states. Now, the fact that Alice emphasized the agency of developing countries doesn't mean that she took this, say, Walt Disney view of the world, in which if you believed in yourself and tried your best, you can achieve anything. No, the world doesn't work like that. So in her later book, Escape from Empire, which was published in 2007, so nearly 20 years later than Asia's Next Giant, which was published in 1989, she emphasized how the global economic system, and especially the outlook and the behavior of the hegemon that shapes and controls that system, significantly defines the possibilities of economic development in the periphery. She criticized the dependency theorists for taking this global economic system as a determinant, but she was very well aware that these are very, very important conditions. So in this book, Alice discussed actually how the United States' two distinct global economic systems before and after the 1980s, or what she calls the first and the second US empires. So in the first US empire, the US enabled these potential competitors, including the enemy countries of Japan and Germany, that were just vanquished by them, to rebuild their economy and catch up with it. So the Marshall Plan was implemented to help reconstruction of the European countries, amounting to something like 3.5% of US GDP at the time. And this money was also given to Germany, Austria, the former enemies, as well as the allied countries. And in case you didn't know, the World Bank's official name is International Bank for Reconstruction and Development. His first job was to help reconstruction of Europe after the Second World War. OECD was initially set up as an organization to disperse Marshall Plan money. So they did that. Also, they gave quite a lot of, not unlimited, but quite a lot of policy space to developing countries so that they could pursue policies they needed. Of course, I'm not beautifying this period. The US during this period instigated so many coups d'etats and assassinations and other political machinations to punish developing country leaders that they didn't like and so on. But, you know, still, I mean, it was quite different from the Second Empire, which started from the 80s, where it basically imposed the same conditions on developing countries as it imposed on other rich countries. And of course, in practice, the most extreme forms of these neoliberal policies were experimented upon in the developing countries, whereas rich countries could actually get away with having much less the stiff conditions if they were borrowing money from the US and so on. Yeah? So in the Second Empire, you first through the structural adjustment programs of the World Bank and the IMF, and then later through the WTO system, and then the numerous bilateral, regional free trade agreements and investment agreement, the policy space for developing countries has been constrained. Yeah? But here I would like to emphasize that it's not non-existent. Yeah? I sometimes joke that the WTO has become the best friend of lazy government officials in developing countries. Yeah? Because when your minister tells you to do something, the easiest way out is to tell him that it's not allowed by the WTO. Yeah? The guy's not going to run to the library, go through 800 pages of WTO agreement and tell you to do it. Yeah? Anyway. But it is true that the policy space has been far more constrained. And yeah, interestingly, the result was basically a collapse in economic growth all around. Yeah? So, you know, the developing countries grew in per capita terms about 3% on average during the 60s and 70s. In the next 40 years of Second American Empire, this growth rate fell significantly. And especially if you look at regions like Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, basically growth has evaporated. Yeah, so this is an important point because the neoliberals trade on what I call growth machismo. Yeah? They say, oh, you know, okay, our policies might have rough edges like increasing inequality and, you know, reduce the access to basic goods and so on, but we at least generate growth. Yeah, I mean, how are you going to give people welfare payment if you don't generate growth? Yeah. But you have to tell them, look, your policy actually has been far worse than these the so-called bad policies of the 60s and 70s in generating growth itself. Yeah. So why are we accepting all these other bad things that you generate if you cannot deliver on your central promise of increased growth? Yeah? Anyway, so this is how the US empire has evolved. Now, before moving on the current phase, which I call the third US empire, I would like to point out that one thing that Alice does not emphasize enough, although she is aware of it, is that both the first and the second US empires are historically unique in that they are based on multilateralism, in which the hegemon voluntarily gives up some of its power in return for greater systemic constraints on what countries, including itself, can do. Yeah? And this is really historically unique because before the US empire, the global economic order was based on bilateral domination by European empires through colonialism and the so-called unequal treaties. Yeah? Now, many people that do not even know what these unequal treaties are, but between the 1810s, I don't have time to go through all this, so that you just look at it, but between the 1810s, 1920s, weaker countries that were not official colonies were all subjected to this thing called the unequal treaty. Yeah? So what it does is, first of all, it often forces the weaker country to lease land to the stronger country. So, for example, when the Britain first imposed this unequal treaty on China after the Opium War called Nanjing Treaty, it leased Hong Kong for 150 years. Yeah? So it became British colony. Yeah? Still, it was only leasing, so it was not formal occupation. And then these unequal treaties gave the stronger countries discounted prices on the mining rights, logging rights, yeah, rights to exploit natural resources. They introduced extraterritoriality, which means that if, say, a British citizen commits a crime in China, he has to be sent back to Britain to be tried, because the Britain says Chinese legal system is not up to the standard. Yeah? And most importantly for economists, what they do is to deprive you of your tariff autonomy, your right to set your own tariffs. Yeah? So all these treaties allow these weaker countries to impose uniform flat rate tariffs of 3 to 5% across all sectors for revenue purposes. Yeah? They were not allowed to use tariffs for industrial policy, for promoting particular sectors. Yeah? You see that if there's a paradox here, yeah? Because if they thought that the free trade was so good, why would they have to basically invade these countries and force these countries to adopt it? Yeah? I mean, they knew that these differential tariffs are essential elements of economic policy. So in the same way that you take their land, take their natural resources, take their nullify the legal system, they were taking away the right to set tariffs. Hmm? Anyways, but when the US became the hegemon, it instituted multilateralism, which is, something to be commended upon, because it is that, of course, even during the multilateral period, the US, designed the system in such a way that it can do whatever it wanted. Yeah. So it's not like truly neutral, but so there are some examples, but still, I mean that even if it's a bad multilateralism, this is far better for developing countries than this bilateral domination. Now, however insightful Alice may have been, I don't think she could have foreseen the dramatic changes in the US approach to managing the global economy that are currently going on. Especially upon coming back to power, Donald Trump has implemented high tariffs against all his trading partners virtually, that, according to him, had been looting, pillaging, raping, and plundering the US economy through unfair practices. And this is quite something. And using the threat of high tariffs, the US has also extracted promises from a number of its main trading partners, such as the EU, Britain, Japan, South Korea, to buy more goods from the US and to invest more in the US. So the Trump administration's wish is that by protecting its manufacturing industries from foreign companies and by inducing foreign companies to relocate their production to the United States, the US manufacturing industry will be revived, thereby making America great again. Yeah? Now, I don't have time to kind of go through and criticize all the absurdities involved in Trump tariffs. So I'll leave that to you absorb some of this at your leisure. But these policies signify a fundamental shift in the US approach to the global economy, because in implementing this new trade policy, the second Trump administration, which I'm now going to call Trump 2, has completely ignored the rules of the WTO, as well as the free trade agreements that the US had signed with other countries like Canada, Mexico, South Korea, and so on. So, for example, when they renegotiated the tariffs with South Korea, with which it had signed a free trade agreement about 12 years ago, they didn't even start by saying, okay, there is this free trade agreement, let's start from there and see how we can adjust it. It was like as if we never signed it. Yeah? And yeah, in doing so, the US has totally abandoned the principle of multilateralism and has gone back to the pre-Second World War order, where stronger countries exploited weaker countries on bilateral basis. Yeah? But actually, it wasn't totally bilateral because, you know, in the WTO, there's this concept of most favored nations. Yeah? So if you are giving a new treatment to one of your trading partners, you have to give it to all other countries because all other countries are supposed to be most favored nations thanks to WTO membership. Yeah? The notion was actually invented during the days of unequal treaties. The deal was that when you sign an unequal treaty with, say, Britain or France or whichever country, you specify that Britain is the most favored nation. And when later, say, the Dutch come and extract some additional concession from you, Britain is automatically allowed that. Yeah? So there was the collective action by these imperialist countries through this mechanism of most favored nations. Yeah? So, you know, some things that you think are very good things that have very dubious provenance. Yeah? Anyway, but, you know, I would like to emphasize that the third US empire that is kind of emerging now hasn't emerged overnight with the Trump too. Yeah? The US has been moving in that direction for the last 10, maybe even 15 years. Yeah? You know, when it set up the WTO back in 1995, the US and its rich country allies sold the organization to the developing countries by agreeing to have a one country, one vote decision-making structure, which is actually quite unprecedented. Yeah? Because in the IMF, in the World Bank, the voting is basically $1, one vote. Yeah? You have votes according to your paid-in capital. Yeah? In the UN, yes, ostensibly it's a one country vote, but 5 countries have veto. Yeah? So when they set up the WTO, they said, you are going to get one country, one vote, and no country will have veto. Yeah? Which is quite amazing. Yeah? Now they did it, the US and its allies, because they thought they could control developing countries through other means. Yeah? We can bilaterally bully them, you know, okay, if you don't follow our policy, we are going to cut off your aid or reduce your market access or flooding the agenda with a lot of new things so that developing countries without enough human and financial resources just find it impossible to deal with. Yeah? And for the first several years of the WTO, it seemed like it was working, but slowly developing countries woke up to the reality. Yeah? And then they started pushing back, especially in the negotiation for the so-called Doha agenda. Yeah? And yeah, by the 2010s, it became clear that the rich countries cannot have their ways in the manner that they had thought they would in the WTO. And before other rich countries, the US started disengaging from the WTO. And this came to its culmination in 2017 when Trump won. The first Trump administration refused to, started blocking new appointments to the dispute settlement body called the appellate body. And it kept blocking it to such a point that by the early 2020, the membership fell below the minimum. So the dispute settlement body was basically destroyed. Yeah? And note that this continued under Joe Biden. Yeah? So the US has been moving in this direction, and the recent actions, yeah, of course, they are far crazier and disorganized and so on, but it's not out of character of the country. Yeah? Okay, now having established that, now we are seeing the emergence of the third US empire. Let me discuss the implications of this for the reshaping of the world economic system, and especially how this is going to affect developing countries. Well, in discussing this, let me first start by saying that the so-called Trump tariffs are not going to work. Yeah? So first of all, this has been said by many people, the current level of US tariffs may not last long due to its impact on inflation. Yeah, we still haven't seen the true effect of this tariffs, because he declared the so-called Liberation Day tariff on the 1st of April. He postponed it until the 1st of August, and then he's still working out exactly who's paying what. Yeah, but it is coming already. There's a sign that the wholesale price is rising in the next several months. This will all kind of feed into the prices, because it's not just that he's I don't know, putting high tariff on China. Yeah, he's putting high tariff on everyone. Yeah. So the inflation is going to rise, and yeah, I mean, even his own Republicans may put pressure on him to lower tariffs, at least on some countries, for some key consumer products, because the Republicans have only 7-seat majority in the American House of Representatives, or what they call the House. Yeah? And they have a midterm election in the November, where these people are coming up for the re-election. Yeah? And if the inflation is serious, they lose a majority. If the Republicans lose the control of the House, the Democrats can seriously challenge Trump's tariff policies, because according to the US Constitution, the US Congress actually has the authority on tariffs. Yeah? Trump is introducing all these new tariffs on the basis of a highly dubious reading of what is known as the International Emergency Economic Powers Act, yeah? IEEPA. Yeah? And last Friday, the US Court of Appeal ruled against Trump administration's use of IEEPA, pointing out that the act does not even mention the word tariffs once. Yeah? So it's like I don't know, there's some kind of war or near war situation with some other country, and then there's some emergency need to impose trade control. I mean, that's the act that is justifying it. I mean, it's not about tariffs. Yeah, it's not about trade balance. Yeah. Well, of course, the ruling is not yet final, but because it has to go to the Supreme Court, which it apparently will in October, November. But depending on the political mood of the time, the Supreme Court, although it is basically the Trump's people, could actually rule against these tariffs, and then all bets are off. Yeah. Yes, I'm not saying that the Democrats will retake the House. I'm not saying that the Supreme Court will rule against Trump necessarily, but there are all these possibilities and uncertainties. Yeah? But more importantly, even if these tariffs are sustained, it is a fantasy to think that the current US policies can restore the US manufacturing sector to its former glory. Trump, yeah, the first thing to consider in this regard is the scale of the challenge. Eh? So Trump says he's going to make America great again with these policies. But what exactly is a great America? Yeah? Because there are many versions. Yeah? Does it mean America 1950? When it produced around 60% of world manufacturing? At this height in 1870, Britain produced 30% of the world manufacturing, and the US produced 60%. It truly was a great country, yeah? At least from an American point of view. Well, maybe he's not that ambitious. I mean, is he talking about mid-1980s that America, which had, in relative terms, hugely declined, its share of world manufacturing falling by half, but still producing around 30%, yeah? Comparable to the British Empire. Yeah? Today, the US produces only around 16% of world manufacturing output against around 30% of China. Yeah? And yeah, it depends on the sector, but in many industries, the US decline is shocking to see. Yeah? For example, shipbuilding. Yeah? The US builds around 10 ships a year. Yeah? The Chinese build 1,700. Yeah? Koreans build 900. Yeah? This is a country which needs aircraft carriers to patrol the oceans to maintain its military dominance, and it cannot build ships. Yeah? It had to back down in its the tariff against China, because the Chinese said, well, if you're like that, we are not going to sell these rare earth minerals to you. Yeah? The Chinese mine 60–70% of all these rare earth minerals, process around 90% of them. So if the Chinese don't sell these things to the Americans, Americans cannot make its famous high-tech weapons, yeah, because it is needed for this precision magnets and all these high-tech equipments, yeah, and so on. I mean, I'm not going to go into that. Yeah? So if it wants to go back to, I mean, never mind 1950 America, but 1980s America, it will take the US 40 years to get back there, yeah, because it has taken 40 years to run it down to the current level. Okay, I mean that you accelerated double the speed, yeah, it will still take 20 years. Yeah? 20 years of mass national economic mobilization. Without it, it's not going to happen even in the 40 years, yeah? Because the logic behind this, the thinking behind this has one crucial gap. Yeah? Let me explain what this is. Yeah. Oh, yeah, before getting there, I also need to talk about the scale of challenge, because you know, okay, it might be difficult for the US to recover 40 years of decline on its own, but Trump is now thinking, oh, I'm so clever, I'm using this sticks of high tariffs against countries like Korea and Japan and Germany and so on, and I'll make them come and invest in the US. Yeah? Create jobs and revive our manufacturing. Yeah? And under pressure, yeah, these countries have indeed said that they will invest more in the US, and they will. But first of all, these investments are going to happen only slowly. And secondly, and more importantly, their scales are not going to be not even nearly large enough to make a big difference. Yeah? So take the case of South Korea. Yeah? Recently, South Korean president visited the United States. Yeah? And he brought all these the Korean businessmen, and these businessmen signed MOUs, memorandums of understanding with American companies to invest in the various industries, shipbuilding being the most important, amounting to $100 billion US. Yeah? Wow, that sounds really a lot of money. Yeah? But first of all, don't forget that these are just understandings. Yeah? So many of these things fall through. Yeah? I mean, this also applies to all these figures of foreign direct investment that many developing countries love to announce. I mean, they announce this when someone says we might invest such and such amount. Yeah. And then it looks really large. Many of them fall through, and the actual amount arriving is not as large. Yeah. So, but the only generous assumption that, say, 2/3 of the sums promised by the Koreans will arrive, that's 100 billion, still quite a lot of money. You have to remember that this sum will be deployed over 4 or 5 years rather than all in just 1 year. Yeah? Because each factory has to be built, and before that, the land has to be bought, and so on and so on. So, you know, even if you say I'm going to invest $10 billion in this factory in Arizona, it doesn't mean that you are going to keep that all in 1 year. Yeah? So even if the 100 billion materializes from Korea, spread it over, say 4 years, that's 25 billion. Yeah, not as large as 150, but still respectable sounding sum. But you have to realize that the US is a $30 trillion economy. Yeah? And investment in the country amounts to $6.6 trillion per year. Yeah? So you add that 25 billion to that, you're not even going to notice, yeah? Because that's only 0.4% of annual investment in the US. Yeah? To put it another way, even if Japan, Germany, and Korea, which respectively produce 5%, 5%, and 2.5% of world manufacturing output, relocate 1/3 of their respective manufacturing production, which is not going to happen for obvious reasons. Yeah, I mean, no government will survive that scale of the industrial relocation. Even if that happened, this will increase the US share in global manufacturing from 16% to 20%. Yeah? Is that America great enough? Yeah? So the size of the US economy is such that it cannot rely on other countries to rebuild this economy. Yeah? The change has to come from within, but here is the problem. Yeah? This is not going to happen. Yeah? Because the US capitalist class is neither willing nor able to invest and rebuild this economy. I'll show you some numbers later. You know, the best justification for protectionism is that of, as you all know, infant industry protection. Yeah? In the same way that we protect and nurture our children until they grow up and can compete in the other labor market, governments of economically backward nations need to protect and nurture their young industries until they grow up. Yeah? So one charitable, and this logic was actually invented by an American, none other than the first finance minister of the United States. That's the guy on the $10 bill, Alexander Hamilton, yeah? Who these days is more famous for, being a character in a hip hop musical than being the inventor of the trade theory. Basically this logic of infant industry protection is what the British used in the 18th century to become the world economic hegemon, although they didn't have a theory like the Americans did. Yeah? Americans used this theory and policy to become the next world hegemon. As I show in these books, almost all the rich countries today use some form of infant industry protection in order to get where they are. So a charitable interpretation of Trump's policy is that it's a geriatric version of infant industry protection. So it's not a child. You have a, I don't know, 50-year-old son who has repeatedly failed in his business because he blew his money on buying luxury yachts and gambling in Las Vegas rather than investing in in his company. And now you are saying, okay, I'll give you extra protection, extra money. Yeah? You go and rebuild your business. Yeah? But the problem is that this guy is not going to change his habit. Yeah? And there's no condition that the firms that are being protected in this way, getting subsidies in this way, has to invest the money in raising productivity, recovering competitiveness. Yeah? The shocking thing is that in the last 25 to 30 years, the US stock market has become an ATM, automatic teller machine, for short-term oriented shareholders, and top US corporations actually do not have the money to invest with anymore. Yeah? I mean, it depends on the exact statistics that you look at. And here's one example. Oh, sorry. Between, in the last 25, 30 years, top US corporations have given away 90 to 95% of their profits to shareholders in the name of shareholder capitalism through high dividends and share buybacks, which is a practice where company buys their own shares to raise share prices so that short-term shareholders can cash in if they want. And 90 to 95 is only the average, don't forget. Yeah? And many companies have actually borrowed money or sold assets to give more than what they make in profit to the shareholders. Yeah? The most shocking example is General Electric. Throughout the 2010s, it has given away 3 times its profit to shareholders. Yeah, in order to do that, it had to sell assets, borrow money. Yeah, and all these companies, the Apple and Microsoft were better. They gave away only 97 and 98% respectively. Yeah, so when you have a capitalist class like this, whatever support you give them through tariff protection, extra subsidies, you are not going to succeed in reviving your manufacturing sector. Yeah? Because as Alice emphasized, you need to impose discipline on the capitalists when you are doing infant industry protection and giving them extra profit that they could not have earned without the trade protection and subsidies. Yeah? If you don't have those the disciplines, then you are just giving free money away to these people. Yeah? Yeah, so to protect all these businesses, the money is all going to go to the shareholders who are not interested in the long-term the viability of these companies. Yeah? So if the US wants to succeed in its geriatric version of infant industry protection, it needs to make its protection and subsidies conditional on firm behavior, especially investments in machines, R&D, and training that will raise their productivity. The Trump administration is not doing that. It's not even talking about it. Yeah? Now, the tragedy is that in this new world of the third US empire, a lot of countries, especially developing countries, are being hurt by having their export reduced. And yeah, it's a terrible problem. I mean, for some countries, it's like, you know, the ground has disappeared beneath their feet, you know. But I think the damage should not be exaggerated, because the US is actually not such an important trading partner for most developing countries anymore, except those in Central America. For developing countries in Asia and South America, China is now the biggest trading partner. For African countries, it's either EU or China. You know, until the mid-2000s, the US was the biggest trading partner of all Latin American countries. But now it's only for Central American countries. Chile, Brazil, Argentina, they are all exporting far more to China than the US. Also, these days, South-South trade, that is a trade between developing countries, far more important than it used to be. A trend that will hopefully get an impetus, further impetus, if the African Continental Free Trade Agreement can be implemented well. Yeah? So back in 1995, South-South trade was 38% of the trade by the southern countries, yeah, the developing countries. Today it's 55%. And it's not all China. Of course, China was the key, but it's not all China, because the share of developing countries, South-South trade in developing country trade increased even without the counting China, from 31% to 40%. Oh yeah, the world is so interesting. I have so many things to say. Also, in the medium term, the impact of the rise of the third US empire may be even smaller than what the current trade statistics suggest, because countries can always redirect their export. Yeah? But in the long run, I believe that the rise of the third US empire is likely to be a positive thing for developing countries through its impact on the global economic system. The point is that the rise of the third US empire has made other countries dare to imagine a world economy without the United States. Of course, at the moment, many countries are playing along because they cannot radically change their trade arrangements overnight. Although countries like China, India, and Brazil are standing up against the US, but over time, even currently friendly countries are likely to scale down their engagement with the US, because they have seen that this country cannot be trusted. Yeah? You sign a free trade agreement, which is a quasi-constitutional law, because it has to be ratified by both countries' parliament. Yeah? And then it one day turns up and says that we never signed it with you. Yeah? So even if you have more reasonable government in the US for another couple of terms, as far as someone like Trump can come back, you are not going to have a long-term relationship with that country. Most importantly, seeing the US completely destroy multilateralism, other countries are likely to want to build a multilateral world economic order without the United States. Of course, it's not going to be easy, but it's more possible than you think. Yeah, the US produces 30% of world GDP. But in terms of international trade, it accounts for only about 10, 12%, depending on the year, because it's a very closed economy. Moreover, these days, there are a few things that you have to buy from the US. Until the 60s, early 70s, there were things that you could only buy from the United States. Computers, semiconductors, commercial airplanes, of large size, even color TV. Now there are very few things that only the US produces. In fact, in this round of the trade renegotiation, the US has been pushing basically primary commodities to its trading partners. So the European Union, Japan, Korea, they all said, yeah, we are going to buy more natural gas from the US. We are going to buy more US rice. Because they don't have something that only that they can produce. And as I pointed out earlier, it's dependent on other countries for many of its key products. So at the moment, people are confused and shocked and so on. And yeah, they are worried about the short-term impact. But over time, the other countries will come to their senses and realize, actually, these guys have very little to offer us. Okay, there are countries like Korea, Japan, where they are militarily occupied by the US. So I'm not saying that all countries are free from the US, but actually it doesn't have much leverage. And I argued earlier pointed out earlier that from developing country point of view, the US is not the most important trading partner anymore. Unlike in the old days, South-South trade is increasing. China, India, Turkey, and many other developing countries are emerging as important international financial actors in lending, foreign aid, foreign direct investment. The importance of Southern-led international financial institutions like the New Development Bank, formerly the BRICS Bank, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and CAF, the Development Bank of Latin America and the Caribbean, they have been growing. Okay, CAF has been around for a while, but it's becoming far more active. Asian Infrastructure Development Bank, the New Development Bank, they are new. And new forms of South-South cooperation have been emerging, such as the launch of African Continental Free Trade Agreement and the expansion of BRICS membership. So I would argue that it is time for, I'll finish soon, time for developing countries to come up with a new agenda for the reform of the global system that builds on their campaign half a century ago for the new international economic order. So that, even I am too young to remember when it happened, because it happened in 1974 and I was only 11 then. In 1974, developing countries that had started campaigning for a new international economic order that called for greater national sovereignty over natural resources, lowering of barriers in the rich countries against developing country export, greater technology transfer, greater regulations of the activities of the transnational corporations, and increase in foreign aid. And some of these things have actually come true, that is 0.7% goal for the 0.7% of GDP goal for foreign aid for rich countries, it actually came from NIEO, the new international economic order. So it's, yeah, I mean, few countries have achieved it, but it's there. In other areas, the rich countries have completely turned the table, and now they have the regulations on what developing countries can do against transnational corporations rather than the other way around. But this is a very important basis to build on, and we need to work on this. Once again, it's not going to be easy because the developing countries cannot do it alone. It depends on what the other big economies like China and the European Union do. And I'm not so sure whether either of them have a clear vision of a new alternative international economic order. Developing countries have been divided and ruled since the days of NIEO, and now they have quite weak sense of solidarity among them. Traditional mechanism of cooperation like G77 has been very, very weakened. Although, on the other hand, as I showed, the material conditions, namely real trade and investment and so on, between developing countries have been improving and making actually the greater cooperation more and more possible. So I think this is time to launch a campaign for a new international economic order, new international economic order, because we already had a campaign on new international economic order. And as the title of the novel by the Jewish Italian writer Primo Levi goes, if not now, when? Because this is a time, that Trump has completely destroyed the existing order. If we don't start this now, I don't know when we can. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Ha-Joon, for this truly epic lecture that I think connected with the thinking and its spirit and its Amsden, swept us through centuries of development, underdevelopment, geopolitics, economic thought, and brought us to the present, to current debates around the Trump tariffs. And I think fittingly ended with what is to be done and the call for a new international economic order, as Ha-Joon said, if not now, when? So a really insightful and inspiring lecture. Thank you, Ha-Joon. Okay, I think we'll have to leave it there because we're already out of time. But thank you again to Ha-Joon. Yeah, I'm not going to repeat what I've said, but it's been a really magisterial, and it's definitely a lecture to remember. Let's have a round of applause. Yeah, and thank you to all those who've attended, particularly those who've joined online, and for all the stimulating questions. Please keep an eye out. This is an annual fixture. Will happen around the similar time next year. So yeah, for those online, please do join us again next year. Thank you and good evening to everyone.